Photographic Composition, Lecture 6, Photojournalism, Part 3. Photojournalism continues to be as important today as it's ever been. Although newspapers and magazines are not as robust as they once were, the need for imagery covering events that are going on in our world are as valuable and highly prized as ever. This photograph by James Nachtwey in the aftermath of the attack on the World Trade Center in New York is an obvious example of creating a sense of what happened and empathy for the people who experienced this particular tragedy. Nachtwey is in the forefront of photojournalists working today. He has covered many conflicts. They are, in fact, now he is among a group called conflict photographers, and in the process of covering events such as war, also finds himself covering what happens to people and places when actual fighting is not necessarily going on. Here we see a child playing on an abandoned tank. And other events going on. This is apparently a funeral somewhere in the Middle East. And it's an absolutely striking composition with the shrouded women not visible in detail, but with this hand beautifully silhouetted against their black shrouds and just the little puffs of cloud in the background. This is a photograph of Nachtwey taken by his colleague Gilles Perez, also a great conflict photographer, and showing that not only do these photographers get involved in covering the action, but whenever possible, do what they can to give humanitarian aid. This is an image of a riot, I believe, following a soccer match somewhere in Europe, also by Gilles Perez. I don't know who the photographer was here, but here again we see Nachtwey in the process of covering fighting going on at what is clearly great danger to himself. Sebastião Salgado is a photographer whose work we've seen in other contexts, mostly having to do with the natural world, but he has also covered a lot of human events, and he has a penchant for photographing in conditions and using long exposures to convey movement, as we see in this image, where the exposure is obviously fairly long because we have blurred people in the foreground. This is also by Salgado of the people working in a copper mine in, I believe, Bolivia. And just the staggering number of people who work in this particular open pit mine is staggering. The conditions they work in is quite horrible, and they do it for very little pay. Bruce Davidson is an American photographer who has been working since the 1950s, documenting life around the country and around the world. He's based in New York, and a considerable amount of his work is in New York. He's also considered a fine art photographer, and some of his projects are self-generated. Most of them have to do, though, with people and their living conditions. This is another Bruce Davidson image. And shows considerable sensitivity to humans in their environment, and what comes through in them, I think, strongly in this particular image, but others, is what's going on with them internally, which is expressed through gesture and activity. He's photographed quite a bit in subways, and in fact did a whole series on people in subways in the 1980s, I believe. Steve Mccurry is well known for documenting people living in exotic locales. In this instance, I believe these are monks who are meditating while hanging upside down. I'm not sure what part of the world this is, somewhere in Asia, though, clearly. He spends most of his time photographing in Asia and Africa. And here we see a dust storm kicking up while this group of women gathers. And here we see fishermen somewhere in South Pacific. And there's a lyrical, almost balletic quality to this that transcends what would otherwise be considered perhaps ordinary activity of these people. Susan Meiselas is another conflict photographer who went to Central America to cover the various wars that were going on down there in the 1970s and 80s, and covering soldiers as well as at times covering resistance fighters of one kind or another. But also, as with most of these photographers, keeps her eye out for other visual opportunities, in this case revealing activity that is happening off camera, but because of the nature of the shadows is fairly clear. Massimo Berruti, another photojournalist who's been working largely in the Middle East and Asia, showing various unrest that's going on there, but also conditions that everyday people are contending with in that part of the world. Jules Samad is an American photojournalist who covers events such as this boxing match, but has also covered the president and his family. And keeping an eye out for extraordinary responses to an encounter like this, where someone actually gets to shake hands with the president. Lauren Greenfield has been documenting life primarily among young girls in Southern California for many years, and revealing aspects of the life of teenage and early 20s young people. We see contestants in a beauty pageant. She also, with the intention of, at first, photographing this family who was intent on building the largest private home in the U.S., ended up making a documentary film about them called The Queen of Versailles. This family that had either given birth to or adopted a large number of kids. This woman's husband had made his fortune in rental housing, and in the process of building this house, which was costing a fortune, watched his fortune deteriorate to the point where they could not finish the house and have had to live in more and more reduced circumstances, with Greenfield covering these events as they unfolded. And here we see the mother with several of the kids. And chaos is sort of reigns supreme at all times in this house.